Blessed are we, chalice lighters of resistance, justice, love, and faith. Blessed are we, the heretics, the outcasts, the walkers of our own way. Blessed are we, border crossers, the refugees, the immigrants, the poor, the wanderers who are not lost. Blessed are we, the transgressors, the trespassers, the passerbys, the cause takers, the defiant, the compliant. Blessed are we, the hand extenders, the sign makers, the protesters, the protectors, the multigender, the no gender, trans women, trans men, non binary, the cisgender. Blessed are we, the friend, the stranger, the lonely, the hidden, the visible, the invisible, the authentic. Blessed are we who rise in solidarity. Blessed are we who cannot. Blessed are we who do not. Blessed are we for this beloved community, and this is who we are. It's good to be together again. It is also a blessing to worship by listening to some music and by lighting some candles. Both have acts of purpose. One public, music is humanity's gift to itself, and enjoying it all seems to be a worthy expense. One private, the giving time for those who wish to go and light a candle, to celebrate, to honor, to remember, or just because you wish to. There's the table, and here is the music.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my life thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul, with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul. My sin, know the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul, with my soul. It is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when my face shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul, with my soul.
We light the chalice this morning, for guided by this chalice, may we seek to understand the causes of flight, like the comfort of a candle flickering in the window of darkness. Let us welcome this child into our home with warmth, nourishment, and love. Would we not want the same for our own child, lost and alone in a strange land? I encourage you to stand in body or in spirit for the lighting of the chalice, and if you would remain standing as together we say our affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help one another. You may be seated. Seeking Mercy, Seeking Home. It's the title of our opening thought this morning by Erica Hewitt, who writes in part. For many reasons, people depart. They leave home or the places given to them in place of a home that might have been lost to war. They seek refuge from thousands of dangers and uncertainties. For many reasons, many of them inconceivable to us who live in relative peace and prosperity, people cannot stay where they are, in places they know. So, for them and their children, they trade the hell they know for the unknown and the foreign. For so many reasons, unimaginable to me and maybe to you too, people give up the sense of belonging. They surrender the climate and food and sounds and smells that their bodies have always known for the new, the unfamiliar, the harsh, the unlearnable. What deep respect these refugees, asylees, and immigrants deserve for this courage, for their capacity to keep moving forward. Some members of our human family are throwing their arms wide open to welcome those seeking mercy and seeking home. Others are taking up arms against them. It is a painful territory that stretches between the merciful and those damned. When human suffering comes spilling over our borders, there's no clear division between them and us. Our country's own policies are culpable, and by extension, us. We have protected our American lifestyle of consumption and corporate rule. We play a role in the inequality, the ecological disasters, and wars over dwindling resources. We lose sight of the fact that we're powerful players in a fragile but wildly interconnected global community. Have we lost a bit of our soul? That's what fear does. Fear is a voice that says nothing matters more than self preservation and self importance. Fear drains the antifreeze out of your heart, so your compassion center runs cold. It cuts off the feeding tube that keep our souls supple and our morality intact. And fear, I think, eats at our soul, and it's what's at the heart of the stingy fool's game of deciding which immigrants are deserving of asylum. Fear says, from my comfortable position of privilege, I will decide whose hell is raw and terrifying enough to merit compassion. For so many reasons, people depart. They leave home or the place that was given to them in a place of in a homeland that must have been lost to war. And they seek refuge from 1,000 dangers and uncertainty. For our reading today, we turn to a piece by Trung Le Nguyen, also known as Trungles, a Vietnamese American comic book writer and storyteller from Minnesota. He was born in a refugee camp somewhere in the Philippine province of Palawan. He writes, Dear liberal allies, you and I learn very different things in very different ways. If you didn't live an experience, please step aside. We students of color, gay students, trans students, children of immigrants and refugees, knew this stuff before our professors told us what to call it. We learned it from the bottom up. You learned it a different way. You received a set of words and a list of definitions. Your learning was, in all likelihood, here is the word, and here is what the word means. For you, xenophobia was a strong fear or dislike of people from other countries. For us, it was xenophobia, the time that boy in my kindergarten class spat on me because I couldn't speak English. Or when I saw that clerk yell at my mom in the grocery store because her English was not clear enough. For you, it was racism, unfair treatment of people who belong to another race, violent behavior towards them. For us, it was racism. That one time I saw that manager tell the sales girl to follow my dad around at Kohl's. Or the one time my neighbor's kid got shot by the police. They tried to cover it up by convincing everyone he was a gang member of the Hamong, but he was not. Or the time my dad told me I shouldn't rollerblade to the library because I'm not white and it's not safe. For you, it was homophobia, a strong dislike of homosexual people. For us, homophobia was that time in sixth grade when Ryan shoved me against a glass door and banged my face in while yelling faggot. This happened until the teacher stopped him. Or that time when my Catholic high school's president told me that although he loved me as a child of God, he still believed I was sinful. For you, it was classism, prejudice, or discrimination based on social. For us, it was classism. The time when my best friend came over to hang out and her parents didn't want her to come over again because they didn't like our neighbor. Or that one time when my friends had no idea what food stamps looked like and I was too embarrassed to explain that. So while you're there learning these academically framed phenomena, we had real problems. We're getting figurative name tags for awful things we already knew. Your weekly vocabulary list was to us just a hollow shadow of our experience. When you step out of class, you get to say, oh, awesome, learning how to be a good ally and a better human being. This will help me. For us, it's more like this. So that's what they're calling it nowadays. When exactly did they say the change was going to come? We pause for our practices, words to ponder, stillness to wonder, music to soothe. Today's words are from a poem called The Cure at Troy. It is an adaptation written in verse of the ancient Greek play Philoctetes. It premiered in 409 AD. Penny's verses were first performed in 1990 and finally published in 1991. Nearly 1,600 years have passed, 16 centuries. Yet the story of the master Greek archer, Philoctetes, abandoned on a desert island by his fellow soldiers and compatriots, then asked to return to fight in the Trojan War, resonated with Henny. He reflected in his verses the return of Nelson Mandela to his people after his 27 years in prison. Following this poem, we'll have Stillness to Wonder. The musical response, There is Love, will conclude our practices for today.
Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing. Call miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. It means once in a lifetime that justice can rise up and hope and history rise.
It is good to have Bill Holston back with us today. And thank you for making the trek from Dallas. He's going to update us on the good, the bad, and the ugly immigration in the Biden administration. His bio is in the morning program, and following his remarks, we'll have an open dialogue where Carol will bring the microphone around and hold it while you ask your questions. Please welcome Bill.
Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be here and speak with you today. On election night this year, I went to a local theater company in Dallas. And my wife and I love theater, and it was one of the things we missed. And so they had a drive-in where you sit in your car and you listen to music. It was all protest music. And a local singer sang Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come," the awesome anthem inspired by Bob Dylan's. That's Sam Cooke. Um, Really, it's a reflection on wanting change. And I thought about that evening. It was such an appropriate song because many of us that have been working in immigration, uh, as I have for decades, were hoping, often hope for change, but certainly in that moment, we were hoping for change. Because the fact is, our immigration policies at that time were being designed by an avowed white supremacist, Stephen Miller. And that's one of the changes that happened during the last 4 years. I always like to let people know I've been doing this work since the War of 1812, and I've been critical of every single administration during that time. And so this is not a partisan statement when I say that the last 4 years were different because the policies were written by white nationalists. And so we were looking for change, and our clients were certainly looking for change because their lives were in jeopardy. And in fact, there has been a lot of change. We now have a new administration, and my wife and I both have our second vaccine shot, both of which were welcome changes. However, there have been a lot of things that have, and there have been changes in policy as well, but other things have not changed. And I'd like to talk a bit about those today. Um, but first, I'm just going to really briefly talk about our organization, Human Rights Initiative, how we responded to the COVID crisis. It was very, very difficult, and we pivoted overnight, really, to performing essential services for our clients because the deportation machine did not slow down during COVID, despite quarantines, despite business shutdown. So we had to continue to represent our clients, continue to respond to things that the government was generating. In addition to that, our clients were very hard hit by COVID, both economically and with the illness. And so we were working in person this entire time, as we are still, in delivering emergency aid to our clients. And so this has been a extremely challenging period. So when I spoke at the very earliest time in the Trump administration, I gave a lot of talks, and I outlined the systematic dismantling of refugee program and the assault on immigrant rights. And those were, as I said, designed by Stephen Miller. Now, Stephen Miller is no longer in control of our policies, but he's still around. He's affiliated with the America First Legal, which is assisting our Attorney General Ken Paxton in suing the federal government to try to force them to turn away children at the border. So the fact that the administration's changed, there are still forces at work trying to further this white nationalist agenda. So I'm going to talk about a number of things that were happened during the previous administration, and then whether or not they still exist. Some of which we're very happy to say changed almost immediately. First was the Muslim ban. Like everyone I know that was an activist in Dallas was at DFW airport when the Muslim ban was rolled out. We were there trying to get people out and into the country. Many of these people were not refugees. They were just people trying to visit their family or here on business, et cetera. And so that was a real mar on our national reputation, I think, and that ended right away. Second was the refugee ban, similar with people from predominantly Muslim countries, were banned as refugees. That ended. Next was the public charge rule. This was a rule that said that if you accepted public benefits as an immigrant, that you could be barred from uh, getting a green card or citizenship later. And it had a tremendous impact on people's willingness to access things like health care and food aid for their children. It was a real, again, real travesty of justice. And that public charge rule was immediately ended, and federal agencies were informed to change that. Fourth, and this is one I'm going to spend a bit on because it was frankly the worst thing that happened during the previous administration. I'll talk about where we are on this now. The so called Orwellian named migrant protection protocol, because they certainly are not for the protection of migrants. Those of us in this world were preferred to call it remain in Mexico. That's what it was. For the first time, we told people that were claiming asylum that no, they could not come into the United States and pursue their case. They were stuck in camps in Mexico to pursue that case. And you may ask yourself, how is that supposed to work? You're living in a refugee camp. How are you going to access lawyers? How are you supposed to access evidence? How are you supposed to even get notice of your hearing? The answer was you weren't. It was a system designed to deny people their ability to pursue those claims. It was an injustice, and thankfully, this administration ended the migrant protection protocol, but um, not before 71,000 migrants were stuck in Mexico, where they suffered thousands of documented cases of kidnapping and rape and murder while they were there, of course, very vulnerable to the cartels that control some of these border areas in Mexico. Now, unfortunately, the government, the so-called leaders of Texas and Missouri, sued the government in order to force this administration to continue the migrant protection protocol. And they were able to persuade a federal judge in Texas to issue an injunction against the Biden administration, forcing them to continue the previous administration's policy of remain in Mexico. And that case went up to the Fifth Circuit and to the United States Supreme Court, who refused to undo the injunction. So, as of today, the migrant protection protocols are being enforced. The Biden administration has certified to the federal court that, yes, we are complying with this federal court order. And now, again, migrants are stuck in Mexico um, because of the federal judge and because of our state leaders suing to force that. The next thing was the asylum cooperative agreements. These agreements that we very, very cynically entered into with Guatemala and Honduras that said if you are seeking asylum, those cases will be administered there. Well, it's absurd, of course, that people seeking refugee assistance in our country would be forced to go back to countries that people are fleeing. So, and ask yourself, was it really our thought that El Salvador and Guatemala were better prepared to administer asylum cases than we are in our system of justice? Well, obviously, we are not. Now, we withdrew from those. This is indicative of this administration. Okay, we withdrew from those agreements because they know these are terrible, unjust agreements. However, we continue to engage with the governments and their militaries, particularly in Mexico, to stop migrants from crossing the borders. We may not have those formal agreements, but we're still cooperating with military in Mexico and Guatemala. And of course, our vice president went to Guatemala and said to refugees, people fleeing those countries, don't come. Well, what a remarkable thing to say to refugees, don't come. I guess we'll put that on the Statue of Liberty and quit being hypocritical. So that was that's one where you say, all right, it's a change, but it's not adequate, really. The next thing, which was, of course, this is a big deal, and it was something we changed for the better, was the zero tolerance. That was the policy where everyone who crossed the border was charged with a crime, And that's what resulted in family separation because the parents were being placed in criminal proceedings. Their children were being taken away from them. And then, of course, we all know now some of those children and their parents will never be reunited because it is entirely predictable that if you take a child away from its parent and ship that parent back to rural Guatemala, the chances of finding them and getting them reconnected with their child is almost impossible. And despite tremendous efforts, I have to say, from the government to try to find these people, they've been able to not do it. So, of course, the entire country, I think, rose up in revulsion at this zero tolerance policy, and even the previous administration withdrew from it, and that policy has been officially ended by this administration. Now, next is perhaps the biggest bad in terms of our current policy, and that's the Title 42 expulsion. Title 42 is a law that it's a public health law. And so the previous administration decided COVID was the perfect vehicle to try to interrupt immigration. And so they thought we will turn people away at the border under the auspice of public health, which sounds very appealing. It's kind of hard to disagree with that. Oh, we need to protect public health. But the problem is is called by the government a Stephen Miller special. This was an opportunistic effort on their part to change immigration policy. The Center for Disease Control did not want to utilize this because they knew, based on all the expert from public health officials, that this was not necessary. There was not a actual public health reason to institute this Title 42. It was purely for anti-immigrant purposes, but they were forced to, and so they did, and so we started turning away everyone at the border under the auspices of Title 42. And despite the fact, ever since inauguration, people that are activists and involved in immigrant rights have been demanding, first asking, now demanding, now protesting that this administration end Title 42 expulsions, and they haven't done it. They continue to today. Now, the Raices and ACLU sued the government and got an injunction for the enforcement of Title 42 against families. So right now we have that protection in Title 42. But something that I think it's really important to point out about this, and I know this is very technical, and that's one of the problems with talking about immigration, is often talking about these human rights abuses like Title 42. You end up with very technical arguments because that's our technical presentations because that's the nature of the law. But Title 42 is a very unjust law, a policy, and it has, and this is really the most important thing I think for you to take away, it has disproportionate impact on Black migrants because often the migrants from Central America are traveling in family units, and sometimes those family units or the children will be permitted into the United States. Haitian, Cameroonian, Congolese migrants often travel as single individuals. And so they are disproportionately impacted. So this is one of the ways that anti-Blackness shows up in our immigration policy. And there's other examples of that as well, unrelated to Title 42. Black migrants are disproportionately deported. Black migrants are disproportionately given higher bond. Black migrants are disproportionately given putting in detention centers. And so as those in our country, as we confront the racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness that so stained our policies for many years, it's really important to pause because it's not, the immigration part of that is not often talked about. And so I really like to lift up the work of Black-led organizations like the Black Alliance for Just Immigration or the Haitian Bridge Alliance. You probably listened to the news in the last few days about the Haitians that are coming to the border. It gets often talked about in these dehumanizing terms like surge or invasion, these othering kind of language to talk about human beings. Well, my goodness, think about a moment about why people might be leaving Haiti. Could it be the earthquake? Could it be the hurricanes? Could it be the fact that their president was assassinated in his home by Colombian ex military? Well, how unstable a country could that be? And as I speak to you here, safe in Denison, we're returning Haitians to Haiti right now on deportation. So I'm just, I always fear when I come and speak to people, they're like, my God, that guy's a downer. Let's not bring him back here. But the fact is, I feel an obligation to speak truth about the things that are going on in our country. I felt that way under the I felt that way under the Obama administration. I felt that way under the Trump administration, and I feel it now. I feel that obligation to tell you this is what's going on, and we can decide whether we want hope in history to rhyme or continue with the status quo or continue with, well, it's better than when white nationalist Stephen Miller was in charge. Well, it is. It is better than when white nationalist Stephen Miller is in charge, but it's still unjust and wrong, and lives are being lost because of it. So I want to go over a couple other things, and then I do want to have plenty of time for questions because I suspect you do have some. Okay, I've had this kind of constant stream of bad news. So are you guys ready for a bit of good news? And that is in again, this is kind of down in the weeds. One of the things the previous administration did, because they had a lot of smart people making these policies. So when Jefferson Beauregard Sessions was the attorney general, he used this procedure of taking case law and referring it to himself for review. So it's important to remember that the immigration courts are not part of the judiciary, they're part of the executive. So the attorney general has direct control over what happens in those courts. So there was this case called Matter of ARCG because so many of the people fleeing Central America were women that were fleeing domestic violence. So case law has developed. Well, I'll back up for just a second. To get asylum, you have to show you have a well-founded fear of persecution for 5 specific reasons: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. The first 4 of those are very straightforward, and I've represented many people that squarely fall into those categories. The 5th is membership in a social group, and that is a characteristic you have that subjects you to persecution. Now, this is usually a characteristic that you can't change, and the clearest example are homosexuals. So gays from Africa and places in Central America where it's very, very dangerous to be an out homosexual. So there's those individuals can claim asylum and often are successful in that. The case law developed that if you are a woman from Central America where the law enforcement does not enforce the laws against domestic violence, so you're subjected sometimes to years and years of abuse. Go to the police say, well, he's your husband, he's in charge of your family. Refuse to enforce the laws that are on the books about domestic violence. Then you try to escape, you try to leave him, you go to another town, he follows you there, and you're unable to leave. The court said in the matter of ARCG that that is a particular social group. Women that are escaping they cannot escape their partners and have suffered domestic violence. So Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, in the matter of AB, these appellate court cases use initials, referred that case to himself for review and overruled it. So this was the attorney general saying this case law protection of the courts, I disagree with it, I overrule it, and it was an effort to eliminate protection for women escaping domestic violence. Well, one of the things that, we were, of course, all of us that were working this area were very critical of that, not just because of the decision, but also because of the precedent of prosecutor actually being in charge of the courts systematically. But Merrick Garland, our new Attorney General, overruled the matter of AB. So just with that one thing, it opened up legal protection again for women escaping domestic violence. And we are doing that. Our organization and many others have been taking these cases and trying to protect women escaping domestic violence. So that's really good news, and I'll give credit to the administration where that's because it's warranted. I want to just finally talk real briefly about Afghanistan, just because it's in everybody's mind. Our organization doesn't do a lot of work with Afghanis other than asylum. We have currently Afghan asylum seekers, people who got here to the United States, applied for asylum. We're representing them. We really don't have the expertise to deal with trying to extract people from other countries. However, as soon as Kabul fell, I started getting phone calls and emails from people. Hey, I'm trying to help somebody. I know someone who's an activist. I know a woman who's a scholar. I know someone's a women's rights worker. I know somebody who's a translator saying, can you help us get them out of the country? And we really didn't know. And so we looked for the organizations that were doing that. There's the International Refugee Assistance Program, IRAP, and they set up online resources for people to try to get information about how to obtain one of these visas to get into the United States. Of course, every administration that's been involved with this for the protection of these, particularly these translators for the military, has bungled, and so it's a really, really ineffective process for many, many years. People who stepped up and assisted our military or assisted other aid workers and have been unable to get visas to come into the United States. And so what's happening now is most of the people coming to the United States are coming into what's called humanitarian parole, which is just really just means you're coming into the United States. But they're not coming in as refugees. For one thing, our refugee system was almost dismantled during the previous administration. And so they're really having to rebuild that. So they're just coming into the United States, and it remains to be seen how they will pursue their claims. It may be what they do is apply for asylum here, which is going to be really difficult because they often did not come with evidence. I heard one person who works on these claims say, look, they were burning evidence. They had to make their way to the airport. They were not carrying with them their identification card that they worked with the United Nations or with the American military. Some were burning their passports because they did not want to be found with those documents. And so this is going to be a very, very fraught process. So I'll end with two things, and then I'd like to just entertain any questions you have. One is just I love it that you chose Seamus Haney's poem. I love that poem. It is such been an article of hope for me to just try to center on hope. But I really like this quote from Václav Havel about hope. Hope in this deep and powerful sense is not the same as joy that things are going well or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is. So that's really served me well, and it serves the activists that we all know, people like John Lewis, that labored their entire life right up until the time of their death to fight for justice. And that is what we need. We need people that will going to persist despite the fact that things don't seem to change, despite the fact that it's hard, and you may actually have to do this work your whole life. And I expect to. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today. One last thing, it was the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I forgot to mention the ugly. The ugly is the fact that we initially, this administration, who had promised during the campaign to increase refugee numbers, did not initially, and said they were going to continue with the 15,000 cap that the Trump administration set. And finally, with huge outcry from refugees and other advocates, changed that policy to increase the refugee. So thank you. Thank you. Any questions?
How did the Haitians get to be here?
Mm, great question. Um, they're similar to they're really very similar to the African. So people from Eritrea, Congo, Cameroon. So, and this has been particularly true with the difficulty of getting visas to get into the United States. So they use smuggling route. So these smugglers will take sometimes through Cuba, often to South America, Brazil, all the way up to South America, Central America, Mexico. And so it takes, and I was reading the story this week about that. Some of these people left years ago. They've been making their way, and they've been stuck. A lot of them have been stuck in, I think it's Chapatula, Mexico, which is in Chiapas. Um, so that's the short answer to your question: is they've used smugglers because there's virtually no other way for them to get in. I had a client from Eritrea one time. She was a Pentecostal Christian, and she had been put in a overseas shipping container and left without food or water. She managed to survive that, and she escaped from Eritrea to Sudan. Let that sink in a minute. She escaped to Sudan, then South Africa, and then flew to Brazil, made her way all the way up South America, Central America, Mexico, swam the Rio Grande River, turned herself into Border Patrol, and claimed asylum. I represented her successfully, and she and her family still live in Dallas and worship freely in the church. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned people coming in on a humanitarian, um, what did you call it?
Pearl.
Okay. I think I heard something about that yesterday. They were interviewing some young people about this, and the young people were saying that there is a $575 charge when you make this application, and they were asking people to call the representatives to see if they could get that fee waived. Is that what you're talking
I
about?
think that's right. Yes, that's right. And these are people who've left with nothing in many cases. And I've also know that there are people that are doing sponsorships. I talked to somebody yesterday that was working with an Afghani family, and they were trying to raise money to support a sponsorship where the people could sign that said they would sponsor them, which is very similar to the way the refugee program worked at the end of the war in Vietnam. A lot of people came in and church groups supported.
Do they all have to go through the courts? They do that as a group or only individually?
Well, what a great question. Um, once people apply, there's two different ways to apply. There's an affirmative process and a defensive. The affirmative process are people who come in here under a visa. We've had I've personally in our agencies had lots of clients like that. They come under some kind of visitor visa or whatever. They apply for asylum. They go for an interview at the asylum office, which is not an adversarial proceeding. It's an interview. It can be it's a very, very exacting interview. It could be many hours interviewing somebody about the things that happened to them. And then the asylum officer can grant asylum there. The other one is defensive. And so that's everybody who crosses the border or comes up to the border, claims asylum. Historically, what happened is they were given what's called a credible fear interview to see if their story, if true, would entitle them to asylum. Then they've been paroled into the United States and they go to court. So that was one of the things that changed with Remain in Mexico and these Title 42 exclusions is people were stuck in Mexico, but they have court case here in the United States. The other part of your question is everybody has what it's called an individual hearing. And these are trials. It's one of the reasons our courts are so clogged is because the affirmative, we place so many people into removal proceedings And we have not, this is something that goes back multiple, it's another failure over several generations of administrations, is we haven't adequately funded our immigration. So we need more immigration judges. And so they have, I think there's something over a million cases that are stuck in immigration court. And every single one of those individuals that has that passed a credible interview gets a hearing in front of an immigration judge. And that's a trial. Government's represented by an attorney. It's truly adversarial. And then appeals to the Bureau of Immigration Appeals, and then here to the Fifth Circuit Court of Federal Appeals. Y'all have great questions.
So this morning on the news, the people that were crossing at Del Rio, they're sending them back by airplane. So when that happens, they just unload those people?
Yeah. First of all, that's called expedited removal. And so that's not, they're not going through any of that process I just described. We are, by doing that, we are violating what's called the right of non-refoulement. And that right comes out of the world's response to the Holocaust. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is we will not return people to harm. And we are absolutely doing that. At the very end of the last administration, we were deporting Cameroonians. Well, Cameroon is in the middle of something akin to a genocide, specifically for the English speakers, because the government's controlled by French speakers there. And we were putting torture survivors on planes back to Cameroon. And there were reports that came out of activists in Cameroon that said people were getting off of those planes and they were being arrested at the airport. You know, that's happens. And so we know that. We are knowingly returning people to harm right now. And it's wrong. Thanks for raising that.
Is probably the obvious question, but how would we stop that, returning people to harm?
Well, I think it's one of the reasons I'm speaking with such heat here today. Part of it is for us as progressives that have been kind of stuck with voting for Democratic candidates because the Republican Party is so controlled by white nationalists, holding that party to account and not giving them a pass. You know, it's like we have to tell our representatives, we have to tell this administration this is wrong, and we're not going to put up with it. I mean, sadly, you know, if your congressman's anti-immigrant, there's nothing you can do other than campaign against it because they're not going to change. But we can speak to this administration that promised better and is not delivering. One other thing you can do, and my development director kick me if I didn't do it, is you can support organizations like us. So North Texas Giving Day is this Thursday, and that's where all the nonprofits in Dallas, there are many of us, Raices, Catholic Charities of Dallas, Mosaic Family Services, Human Rights Initiative, all of us have been doing this work. We've been doing it for 21 years. So this is not a new thing. Thanks, good question. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure speaking to you.
When Robert Shelton was the treasurer, he had a special way of asking people to donate to the church. While we may not have the quote exact, it was something like the lines of, "The bowl awaits, friends. Please go fill it up so I can write the checks to keep us all afloat." The bowl awaits this morning, and if you'd rather not move, we do have a donate tab on the app for the church.
We would be one as now we join singing our hymn of love to pledge ourselves anew to that high cause of greater understanding of who we are and what in us is true. We would be one in living for each other to show to all a new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which binds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves to greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free.
I invite you to rise in body or spirit for the benediction and extinguishing our chalice, the words for which are printed in our program. Here are the words of Reverend Eric Cherry. Let us hold the refugee and the immigrant in prayer. May God be with you. May your grief and loss be assuaged. May the hard road you travel include spaces of rest and security. May you know your inherent worth and dignity every day of your journey. Let us pray for the people you meet along the way. May they remember how they too were strangers. May they embrace the pathways of compassion. May they recall the teachings of the prophet. May they make room in their heart and